I must warn you, what you're about to hear is not the kind of royal tale found in school books. Behind the glittering crown of Spain's Ferdinand VII lay a kingdom drowning in corruption, scandal, and obsession. When he first came to power, the people called him the Desired, a symbol of hope after years of turmoil. But that hope quickly turned to despair. His reign twisted into betrayal, cruelty, and perversions that would scar Spain for generations. This is not the story of a noble king defending his people. This is the story of a man who betrayed them, and in doing so, betrayed history itself. Stay with me, because once you uncover the truth, you'll see why Ferdinand VII is remembered not as a savior, but as one of Europe's most infamous monarchs. Spain in the early 19th century was a kingdom on fire. Napoleon's armies swept across the land, tearing down cities and leaving famine in their wake. Ordinary people starved, families begged in the streets, and once proud villages fell into silence. Beyond its borders, Spain's empire, once the richest in the world, was collapsing. Gold and silver no longer poured in from the New World. Colonies that had fed the crown now whispered of rebellion and independence. Spain was not just weakened, it was bleeding. And yet, in the middle of this despair, a figure appeared, Ferdinand VII. To the exhausted masses, his return to the throne was like the rising of the sun after endless night. Crowds filled the streets, chanting his name, convinced that salvation had come at last. He was hailed as the Desired, the king who would restore Spain's honor and secure its future. But power has a way of revealing the truth. At first, Ferdinand seemed to carry the hopes of his people, yet soon the cheers turned to whispers, not of a savior, not of a noble monarch, but of a man consumed by greed, twisted by paranoia, and ruled by desires no crown could ever satisfy. At first, Ferdinand VII wore the mask of a savior. He entered Madrid as the king of the people, promising to restore Spain's honor and liberty. Crowds cheered, believing a golden age had returned. But promises are fragile, and Ferdinand shattered them one by one. The Constitution, symbol of Spain's fragile freedom, was ripped apart. Rights once granted to the people vanished overnight, assemblies dissolved, dissenters silenced, and soldiers were ordered to enforce his will. What had begun with cheers quickly descended into fear. Inside his palace, paranoia grew like a shadow. Ministers who offered advice were dismissed, trusted companions exiled, friends betrayed. Even those closest to him realized their loyalty offered no protection. Ferdinand's rule was not about guidance, it was about control. But politics were only part of the darkness. Rumors spread of secret indulgences, of appetites unbecoming of a monarch. While famine haunted the streets, the king hosted lavish feasts. Nobles whispered of hidden chambers, of scandals too shameful to record. The man once hailed as the Desired became a bitter joke. The corrupt. His reign revealed not a savior, but a tyrant, one who would leave scars on Spain far deeper than any foreign invasion. The royal palace of Madrid no longer functioned as the true heart of Spain's government. Instead, it had become the theater of Ferdinand VII's obsessions. Behind the glittering halls and gilded walls, corruption and desire dictated the rhythm of life. Ferdinand treated people as possessions. He gathered lovers like trophies, using power to seduce or coerce. Many of the young women summoned into his presence had no choice. Some were promised gifts or security, while others were threatened into submission. For the king, these encounters were never about affection or passion, they were about control. The crown itself became his lure, and the throne his weapon. Inside the palace, fear kept everyone silent. Courtiers, ministers, even priests looked the other way, unwilling to risk angering a monarch whose paranoia and cruelty were well known. The corridors echoed with whispers, but no one dared speak openly. Outside, the reality was far bleaker. Spain reeled from famine, unrest, and war, yet the king turned his back on the suffering of his people. While the nation starved, Ferdinand indulged in grotesque entertainments, proving that his palace was not a seat of justice but a cage of excess. Ferdinand's cruelty stretched far beyond whispers of scandal. It became the very foundation of his rule. He was a monarch who seemed to draw satisfaction from pain, turning Spain into a kingdom ruled by fear. Those who dared oppose him, liberals, reformers, or even cautious critics, were branded enemies of the crown. Many were imprisoned, dragged into dungeons where torture was common. Chains, darkness, and endless interrogations broke spirits rather than uncovered truth. Some prisoners were executed quietly, their names erased, while others rotted away in cells until death came like a release. Even within the palace walls, no one was safe. Ministers fell from favor overnight, their loyalty meaningless. Friends were betrayed, their lives destroyed at the king's whim, and his cruelty touched his own blood. Wives, relatives, even close companions were treated as pawns, humiliated, manipulated, and discarded whenever they no longer served his purpose. For Ferdinand, the crown was never about duty or responsibility. It was about domination of subjects, courtiers, and even family. His rule was not leadership, but tyranny. The same crowds who once shouted his name in triumph now spat it in fury. Ferdinand had returned as the desired, but to the people he quickly became the despised. Spain itself was crumbling around him, its great colonies in the Americas breaking free one after another, declaring independence as the empire that once ruled the seas fell to pieces. While towns starved and rebellions spread, Ferdinand sat in Madrid, a prisoner of his own lusts and paranoia. He trusted no one, dismissed advisors who dared to speak truth, and surrounded himself only with flatterers. The disconnect was staggering. While soldiers bled on distant battlefields and peasants begged for bread, the king drowned himself in excess. Even foreign diplomats, usually cautious with their words, began writing letters filled with disgust. They described him as a monarch ruled by passions rather than reason, a man too blinded by desire to see his kingdom collapsing beneath his feet. To his own people, Ferdinand was no longer the savior they had prayed for. He had become a curse, a living symbol of Spain's humiliation and decay. By the time Ferdinand reached the twilight of his reign, he was a shell of the man who had once been hailed as the desired. His body was ravaged by disease, his frame swollen and bloated, his mind clouded by paranoia. He rarely appeared in public without showing the weakness that betrayed him, and when he did, the people whispered with contempt rather than admiration. But even as his strength withered, one obsession still consumed him: the question of succession. Without an heir, his dynasty would crumble, and with it, his last shred of power. Desperate, he placed crushing pressure on his young wife, Maria Cristina, demanding she produce a child who could secure the Bourbon line. When, at last, she gave birth to a daughter, Isabella, what should have been relief only ignited new chaos. Spain was thrust into the Carlist Wars, bitter conflicts fought over whether a woman could inherit the throne. And so, even in death, Ferdinand's shadow stretched across Spain. He left not stability, not unity, but decades of bloodshed, division, and distrust. His final legacy was not of a king who saved a kingdom, but of one who cursed it long after the grave. So what truly remains of Ferdinand VII? Not the glory of a victorious king, nor the wisdom of a just ruler, nor even the strength to rebuild the empire Spain had lost. What endures instead is a legacy of betrayal. He betrayed his people's hopes, tore apart their constitution, and turned their trust into ashes. Historians, looking back, would brand him with a damning title, the worst king Spain ever had. Yet, for those who lived through his reign, the words of scholars are far too gentle. To them, Ferdinand was not merely a failed monarch, he was a figure of corruption and cruelty, a ruler who turned Spain's crown into a mask for his vices. And so, when his name is spoken today, it is not with admiration, but with scorn. For Ferdinand VII is remembered not as a king of Spain, but as a monster draped in royal robes, an emperor of shame whose shadow still lingers over the nation's history. And so, the reign of Ferdinand VII became more than history. It became a warning, a cautionary tale of how absolute power, mixed with greed and obsession, can rot a man from the inside out. The people who once shouted his name with joy soon whispered it in anger, praying not for his rule, but for his downfall. His name, once sung in the streets of Spain, was later cursed in hushed tones, passed down through generations as a reminder of betrayal and corruption. He was not remembered as a king of glory, but as a symbol of what happens when a crown becomes a weapon. But I leave you with this thought. If a monarch, chosen and celebrated by his own people, could fall so far into darkness, then what secrets, what scandals might still be buried within the gilded shadows of Europe's royal families today?